Now hear the word of the Lord from 2 Samuel 7:5-17. Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord has declared. Are you the one to build the house for me to live in? I have never lived in a house from the day that I brought the Israelites out of Egypt until this very day. I've always moved from one place to another with a tent and a tabernacle as my dwelling. Yet no matter where I've gone with the Israelites, I have never once complained to Israel's tribal leaders, the shepherds of my people Israel. I never asked them, why haven't you built me a beautiful cedar house? Now go and say to my servant David, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies has declared. I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have destroyed all of your enemies before your eyes. Now I will make your name as famous as anyone who has lived on the earth. And I will provide a homeland for my people Israel, planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past, starting from the time that I appointed judges to rule my people in Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build the house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod, like any father would do. My favor will not be taken from him as I took it from Saul, whom I removed from your sight. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. So Nathan went back to David and told him everything that the Lord said in his vision. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
You may be seated, Matt. Good morning, Sojourn. Peace be with you. It's good to see you. Good to be with you this morning. My name is Jonah. If you're a guest or visiting with us, welcome. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's our joy to have you with us. Our mission as a church, if you want to know what's happening, what are we doing here, is to reach people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the good news of who Jesus is and what Jesus has done for all of us, and then to build one another up as his church, and then send each other to follow him as instruments of truth, beauty, and goodness. So that's what we're about. That's our mission and values. Reach, build, send, and truth, beauty, and goodness. If you want to learn more about what that means, what does that look like in the culture and life of our church, every few months we have a class called Orientation. That's coming up September 13th and 14th. The title is clever. It's so mysterious. What are we doing? It's orientation. This is who we are. This is what we love. Like if you've ever went to college or started a new job, you have an orientation day. And so this gets into more, what is our values? What are our values? What do we love? How do we live? Why do we do things this way? If you're interested in that, you can open up the Sojourn app. It's free to download. It's right there on the front page. You can open up the digital Sunday bulletin there. There's a link to sign up there. You can get information. I mean, pretty much anywhere there's information to get, you can get it there. You can sign up on the website, September 13th and 14th. The night, it's like a dinner party. We'll have dinner provided, and then in the morning, breakfast, and you'll get the chance to meet pastors and deacons and staff and ask a bunch of questions. So hopefully you can come to that if you're interested to learn more about who we are, what we love, and what we're doing here. You're all invited. It's also our first step in the membership process. So if you're curious about becoming a member, or you want to know, what's in it for me, or what am I committing to if I become a member of this church, that would be your first step. So again, September 13th, 14th, orientation class. Hope you can make it. For many of us, this is the most hopeful time of the year, particularly every 4 years. The whole election thing is coming up. If politics makes you uncomfortable, avoid our church for the next 3 months. We're just going for it. I'm going to see if I can preach myself out of a job. We're going to be talking about it. So just get let's all just have our heart race increase here for a minute together. But, if our guy wins or our lady wins, then, oh boy, everything's going to get better. Everything's going to change. The 9 o'clock service is really disappointing in this. Does anybody care about NFL football? So if you're an NFL football fan, this is the most hopeful time of the year because this is the year our team is going to win. If my friend Jamin is a Chicago Bears fan who listens sometimes, Jamin watches Caleb Williams throw one good pass last night, and then all of a sudden the Bears are finally going to do it. Or, the Browns win the offseason for the 70th year in a row. Or me, I've been a Cincinnati Bengals fan for 25 years. I'm not going to talk about the Colts. Anthony Richardson's going to do it this year, guys. But you know what I mean? It's the most hopeful time of year, and then every 4 years we get this extra dose of hope because the election is coming. And a question I want us to consider as we think about this kind of hope is, what do you do when God says no? Or maybe a little bit more uncomfortable, what do you do, as God has been saying to my prayers for the Cincinnati Bengals, what do you do when God says not yet? Not a straight no, but just kind of a delayed no. The verses that Asia read for us from 2 Samuel here are filled with so much hope, so much promise. And I would argue that these verses and the promises in them are core to understanding the message of the Bible. They are the fundamental invitation of the Bible. I would put it to you this way. What's the Bible about? What's the core invitation of the Bible? It's to turn your heart to the promised King and set your hope on his kingdom. Set your hope on his kingdom. And it's a good reminder because, as every NFL fan knows, this is probably not your year, right? Like, the things we put our hope on often leave us disappointed and even in more pain. Certainly we've experienced that with politics over the last few years. So we have this invitation before us. Turn your heart to the promised King and set your hope on his kingdom. What's difficult for us, though, and I don't know if it's difficult because we're human or because we're Americans or because most of us are Hoosiers. These are not yet promises. Anybody ever prayed for something on a Tuesday and you get mad by Wednesday morning because it hasn't been answered yet? These are not yet promises. This week, we're in our second week of the series called The Fall of the House of David. We're not falling yet. We're ascending. This week and next week, we see the ascent of the house of David. They grow in wealth, in power, and influence. Things are going to get terrible really fast, and we'll be in the terrible part for like 3 months. But right now, we're in the happy part. These are the good old days that we're going to be looking at. The promise that is made to David here takes, listen now, 1,000 years to even look like it's being fulfilled. And so that's the time from David to Jesus. The time from Jesus to us is 2,000 years. And the promises that we just heard are not yet fulfilled. So we've got 3,000 years here between promise made and promise fulfilled. We're going to see, if you go read 1 Samuel, we talked about it last week, these stories are wild. If you read it and try to make a movie in your mind about it, these are incredible stories. God's first warning to Israel is like, hey, if you want a king, he's going to take your sons and make them his soldiers. He's going to take your daughters. He's going to take your land. He gives all of these warnings. And then when they get the kings, he says, kings, if you do this, the whole thing's going to collapse and you're going to be exiled to another country. The time between the first warnings to the warnings coming true, it takes hundreds of years. So we have to feel some of the tension. We have to learn to accept some of the tension between promise made, promise fulfilled. God's plans are not like our plans. God is different from us in some fundamental ways. And one of the biggest ways is that God is patient. You and I are not. So, what do you do when God says no or not yet? The story in 2 Samuel 7 opens with David saying to the prophet Nathan, look, I'm living in a beautiful cedar palace, but the ark of God is out there in a tent. So David here is the shepherd boy that God chose through the prophet Samuel to replace Israel's first king, Saul. So you've got Saul, the first king of Israel, replaced by David. And David, now here in Jerusalem, in the palace, is noticing something ironic and out of place. If you don't know the story of David, I'll give it to you real fast. You can read about this in 1 Samuel into the beginning of 2 Samuel. Saul's the kind of king you and I would ask for. He was handsome, he was large, he had shiny armor, he was a war leader. He was the kind of guy that walked into a room and you'd be like, that guy's in charge. He was just impressive. David was the youngest in his family. He was kind of the runt of the litter, and he was a shepherd. When Samuel chose David over Saul, David was a young teenager, maybe even 12, 13, 14. He wasn't the firstborn of the family, worthy of the honor and the next in line. He was the runt, and he was a shepherd. He was small. I don't know if you know this about David. At one point, he puts on Saul's armor, and it's so heavy he can't even move. So you go from big Saul to little David, the impressive one to the runt of the litter. And Saul didn't give up his throne easy. Even when Samuel anointed David in the name of the Lord, Saul refused a peaceful transfer of power, as it were. And so Saul spends all this time chasing David around, trying to kill David. But the Lord made a way for David. There's a long gap in the story between Samuel anointing David as king and David showing up in Jerusalem as king. Time where he's waiting, time where it's scary, where it's dangerous. But the Lord made a way for David. Some of you know what it feels like for the Lord to make a way for you. Amen? You feel trapped, you feel stuck, you don't see any way how it could be forward, and then you wake up one day and you're like, oh my gosh, how did we get here? Some of you know what you do when that happens. When you feel the anxiety rolling over you so strongly, life is over, there's no way out, the Lord makes a way for you, you really worship. Something rises up in your heart, and you figure out, what does you worshiping really look like? Sometimes for me, I spin around like an airplane in my office because I'm a bad dancer. And this story makes me feel encouraged, because at the end of chapter 6, David is so excited seeing that the Lord has made a way. The ark is coming back to Jerusalem, which you could think of it like God's coming home. David starts dancing in the street, and we know he's not good at it because his wife is embarrassed. Can we kind of relate to that? She's looking out the window being like, oh my gosh, look at him. They get in a little fight over it. But when the Lord makes a way for you, something rises up, and whatever you worship, whatever that looks like for you, it just happens. David looks around, and he's like, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not the impressive one in my family. I'm not the good-looking one in my family. I'm not the talented one. And this guy tried to kill me. I've been living in the woods all this time. And now here I am in a palace. The ark is back. He can't believe that he gets to be in a palace, and he looks outside, and the Ark of the Covenant, which was basically the presence of God, is outside in a tent. Since Israel left Egypt, God's presence has been housed in a tent. Place to place, desert to desert, a tent. So David, in essence, says, God has done something great for me, so I'm going to do something great for God. Anybody ever felt that way? You ever said that? Some of you, I don't mean this in a happy way, probably a lot of your Christianity has been driven by Jesus did something big for me, so I better do something big for Jesus. As you read these stories at home, you got to notice that God always puts a prophet next to the kings, and that's not for good reasons. We're on the ascent right now, okay? But we'll see what the prophets are doing in a few weeks. But now you got to know, David is talking to his buddy, Nathan the prophet. And what he says to him is basically like, I'm in this beautiful palace. Let's build a nice house for God. And Nathan the prophet looks at him and says, go ahead and do whatever you have in mind. The Lord is with you. This is not a trick. We're going to do crowd participation time. I'm not trying to trick anybody. Is this a good idea for David? Yeah. He wants to build a nice house for God who's been in a tent for hundreds of years. Is it come from a good place in David's heart or a bad place? Good, right? Like, he's so overwhelmed by what the Lord has done. He's like, let's do something big for God, something great for God, because I love God. You got to see, this is a joyful response to the Lord. He says this right after dancing and doing his helicopter move out in the street while his wife's making fun of him, right? He's dancing, he's singing. This is a joyful, grateful response. It's a good idea coming from a good place in David's heart. And apparently Nathan said, he's like, yeah, man, why not? But that night, so you read some of the in between the lines here a little bit. Does the Lord speak to the prophet or does the Lord speak to David? He speaks, it's okay if you don't know. He speaks to Nathan. He speaks to the prophet, which tells us something about how things are going to go down the line. But he says to Nathan, go and tell my servant, David, are you the one to build a house for me to live in? Which is maybe a little bit of an indirect or implied way of saying, hey, man, no, not you. It's not for you to do. If you want to understand the story of the house of David, really of the whole Bible, you're not going to like what I'm about to say, but it's true. And you got to learn to live with it or you'll fight it your whole life. Sometimes God says no. To good ideas, to good plans that come from a good, sincere place in your heart, sometimes God says no. Is David being punished here? Anybody know the story willing to take a risk? No. What has David done wrong here? Nothing. A sincere response out of true love for God. And God says, not for you, buddy. Sometimes God says no. A lot of us see no, frankly, as an un-American word. We don't like limitations. We don't like the pain that can come from no. So many of us don't say no to our children. We don't say no to a spouse. Anybody ever gotten mad when your boss tells you no? Gotten mad when your doctor told you no? And boy, we really don't like it when God says no, because you don't have to crowd participate on this. I've been through enough, okay? You don't have to answer this out loud. Most of us don't come from God or come to God telling him what we're going to do from him. We come to God telling him what he needs to do for us. So when he says no, it usually means he says, no, I'm not going to do that thing you asked me to do. But you got to notice, David is saying, this is what I want to do for you, God. And God still says no. So what do you do when God says no? How do you handle it when God says, not yet? Or what he says to David here. Not only does he, this is probably the one I would handle the worst. God doesn't just say no to David. He says, not you, but that's a great idea, man. I'm going to have somebody else do it. Not you, David, but me and my buddy over here, we're going to go do this together. And I'm actually going to wait until after you die so you don't even get to see it. But it gets stranger still. I really encourage you guys to spend some slow time on this passage and try to sift through all the emotions that David probably felt. God responds to David's desire to serve him with a promise of how God is going to serve David. Imagine telling God something wonderful that you want to do for him, and he responds by saying, no, you're not going to do that for me. And in fact, I'm going to do something wonderful for you. This story, don't get it twisted, is not about what David can do for God. It's about what God is going to do for David. This story is about what God is promising to do for David. And to set him up for it, God reminds David of what he's done for him already. So he says to Nathan, tell David this, I took you from tending sheep in the pasture and selected you to be the leader of my people. God reminds David that God is the great way maker because he's about to make a new way for David. If you thought the jump from last-born shepherd to righteous king of Israel was a big jump, well then get ready for what comes next. God says, remember, I made you a shepherd and turned you into the leader of my people. Now, he says, I will make your name as famous as anyone who has ever lived on the earth. This promise has come true. King David, that name means something in every corner of the world. He's a key figure in 3 world religions, and yet he is the last born. He's the baby. He's the shepherd who is made a king, and he is a big deal, not because of his accomplishments or what he's done. He's a big deal because God made him so. And then try to put yourself in David's position, particularly if you have any kind of Jewish background or you know the story of the Old Testament at all. Try to imagine the emotions this would feel for David, or this would hit for David. God goes on, he says, I will provide a homeland for my people Israel. planting them in a secure place where they will never be disturbed. Evil nations won't oppress them as they've done in the past. I will give you rest from all your enemies. Can you imagine what this would sound like after hundreds of years of oppression and violence? A lot of us frankly can't. Imagine the whole story of your family, as far back as your family story goes, is oppression and violence. Slavery, living on the run, wars with other nations. Even David just now, hunted by Saul, living in the woods, sneaking around. And God looks at him and he says, I promise you are safe. I promise you will be safe. You have a home. And can you imagine how sweet this might sound? Maybe it sounds pretty good to some of you. You will be stable. Then verse 11, I'm just going to read one word. God says, furthermore. So, try to imagine David is the last person in his family that we would expect to be chosen. He goes from being in the woods with sheep to being in the woods running for his life to being in Jerusalem on the throne to now God saying, you will be safe forever. And then God has the audacity to say, furthermore. I need to remind some of you that we worship here, the Christian church worships a God of abundance. We worship a God of excess. We worship a God of furthermore. Not barely enough, not just get by. We worship a God of excess. He's not just taking David from being the runt to being the king, from being the shepherd to being the king. He says, furthermore. Just try to wrap your mind around that. Turn your heart to the promised king and set your hope on his kingdom, because his kingdom is a place of excess. His kingdom is a place of abundance. It's a place of furthermore. Somewhere it is written, it is a place where God will do exceedingly more than you can ask or imagine. Some of you see God as this stingy uncle, barely, like handing out 50 cents when you ask for help with your rent. God is a God of excess who will do exceedingly more than you could ask or imagine. So not only does he say to David, you will be safe, you will be free from oppression, you will find rest from your enemies, but furthermore, he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring. I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name. I will secure his royal throne forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. My favor will not be taken from him as I took it from Saul. Your house and your kingdom will continue before me for all time, and your throne will be secure forever. Such sweetness and tension in these promises, as there are in most of the promises of God. It all begins with David saying he wants to build a house for God. And God says, no, not you, but him. Your son, your descendant. There's tension there. Yes, but not you. No, but not yet. You don't get what you want, not yet, but you do get a dynasty of kings, not a temporary change promise. Did you notice the strength of some of these words? Let me remind you if you missed it. He says, I will secure your royal throne forever. So, who will secure it? David, if you're smart and if you're strong and if you... No, God says, I will secure it. The security of the house of David, of the line of David, of this royal throne, the security of it is in the hands of God, not in the lineage of kings, as we'll see pretty soon. And how long will this royal throne last? You know, this word said forever. That means forever. In Greek, forever means forever. Right? That's whatever. That's a seminary joke. In the Greek, it actually means forever. In Greek means forever. He says, your kingdom will continue for all time. He says, your throne will be before me forever. As long as there is time, there will be a ruler on the throne of David. This is the promise of the Lord. This is the promise of the house of David. And the language of the promise is worth pressing into. Did you notice? I'm begging you to notice. If you didn't, I'm going to force you to notice it. Did you notice that God prefers a shepherd king over a Saul king? As he's making this promise, God reminds David where he came from. He says, you were a shepherd. If you go just a couple verses back, because maybe you didn't hear it when Asia read it for us, God calls the leaders of his people my shepherds. When God talks about this wonderful American word that we're obsessed with, that the Bible says almost nothing about, leadership or authority, God talks about shepherds. It's not a coincidence that God chose shepherds. Israel's king was meant to be a shepherd. Some people try to really twist and jump and do hoops around this word shepherd to make it sound like an aggressive, macho word. It is a boring, farming, slow word. It's not cool or aggressive. Shepherds gently led their sheep with love, carrying them to a place where they could thrive in safety. What did shepherds do? They moved their flocks to places where there was good grass. And then what did they do? They sat there and watched them in case somebody tried to hurt them. So they would protect them, or they would provide them a place of safety. Israel's kings, leaders in the Bible, were never meant to be domineering authority figures like the nations. I promise you, this is in the Bible. You can go and listen to the sermon last week. God says, if you get a king like the other nations, he'll lord his authority over you. He'll take your children. He'll throw taxes on you. He'll take your best fields and your best vineyards. And God says, this is not how my people are. My kings are shepherds. He wants a shepherd king, not a Saul king. When I'm begging you to reshape your imagination so that when you think of authority, when you think of leadership, when you think of who's supposed to be in charge around here, think of shepherds. One of the worst things, I believe this with all of my heart, one of the worst things that's happened to American churches is we've become obsessed with corporate leadership and productivity. Efficiency, productivity, who's in charge, who delegates authority, who gets to tell people what to do. And I'll just let you know, be uncomfortable if you need to be. Being a shepherd is one of the least productive vocations there is. They sit there and they watch. They have like an hour of intense productivity once every 3 weeks. That's why they do things like write songs and play instruments. What else are you going to do? I'm going to play the flute and smoke a pipe and write hymns to the Lord. And that's what David does. Being a shepherd is one of the least productive vocations there is, but it's one of the most present and relational ones. One day a shepherd will come into a group of domineering authority figures. He will say to them, I am the good shepherd, not I'm the good authority figure. And he says, I call my sheep by name. They recognize my voice and they come to me. Shepherds know their sheep. They're present amongst them. They don't lord their authority over them and domineer them. They lead them to places of safety and flourishing. Notice the relational language God uses in the promise to his shepherd king. He says, I've been with you wherever you have gone. He never praises David for what a cunning war leader he was or what a skillful songwriter he was. He says, I was with you wherever you've been. I have been with you. I know the promise. Can you imagine how insane this would have sounded to David? A short time ago, he's sleeping in a field with sheep, and now God is saying, you're going to be one of the most famous people who've ever lived, and your line will endure for eternity. And God is in essence saying, like, listen, man, I know this sounds crazy. I know you can't wrap your head around it, especially a shepherd boy, but I am with you. Speaking of his future king, God says, imagine God saying this, I will be his father, he will be my son. If he sins, I will correct and discipline him with the rod like any father would do. Hear the tenderness and the intense relational realities of this language. This is, if you need to feel smart today, you could say, this is an Edenic vision, a vision of Eden. This is a restoration of how things were meant to be. God is with us. We are with God. He dwells with us as our true Father. Last week we said that kingdoms thrive as they listen to and depend on God, like a child depends on her father. This is the vision God gives for his kings. This is the language of relational dependence. This is the ideal, and this is the promise of the house of David. You got to see that the ideal is a little bit sober here, because it's God giving it to Nathan, and Nathan gives it to David, right? There's a prophet here. There's a mediator. So what I'm asking you, don't put your hope in David. Don't put your hope in Solomon, like we'll look at next week. The fact that a prophet is communicating this tells us the story doesn't end with this guy. The story doesn't end with the next guy. There is a guy that is coming. God always ensured a prophet was there with each of his kings, but because he knows, we're going to see this over and over and over. God knows that just as a king leads a kingdom astray, so too wealth, influence, and power lead the heart of the king astray. So I'm not asking you to put your hope in David or Solomon or whoever your candidate of choice is. We are promised an eternal, forever house with a relational God leading, caring for, and protecting a profoundly dependent people, which means we are to turn our hearts towards this king and set our hope on his kingdom. There is an eternal kingdom that is coming. This one is passing away. One of David's descendants will sit on that throne forever. That king will be like a son of God. We may, in fact, refer to him as the Son of God. And through that Son, God will dwell with his people forever. So the invitation is to turn your heart towards this king and set your hope on his coming kingdom. If you're willing and able, stand with me and we'll pray together.